that I was saying, the deepest learning I think that I had were in those moments of sitting around drinking coffee in people's homes and just talking, you know, just sharing. Any other thoughts or comments?
What was one of the most moving experiences or sights or, I guess experience was a good word, that you experienced when you were in or around the refugee camp?
You know, the first image that came to my mind was the wall. And the growth of the wall from when I was there in 1998 to when I was there 10 years later in 2008. And how it just grew, dividing communities, being, you know, where, I think it was near Rachel's tomb in Bethlehem, where we would walk from Ida Camp to a pizza restaurant. And when I went back in 2008, we couldn't do that anymore because there was the wall that was in between. And that's what people would ask me. They would say, like, especially if I was seeing them again after 10 years, they would say, "Have you seen the wall? Have you seen the wall?" And they were referencing the growth of it. And I think, you know, part of that also was to see. Somebody had mentioned too, like about the results of the cycles of violence, what it creates in community, what it creates in family, and sometimes we would like to believe that won't happen to our family. You know, that won't happen to Palestinians. That there's too much strength within their family. But it was sad to see, especially meeting with the WEAM people who work on conflict resolution in the communities, to hear them say that it's growing, the violence is growing, family violence is growing, and it's because of the oppressive cycle of violence that's writ large in their lives. Yeah, so I think that was probably one of the most profound things for me. Any other thoughts or comments? Is there any? Oh, sorry.
Just wondering, what was the name of the Mennonite organization you were working for?
Mennonite Central Committee, MCC.
So you touched on some of the issues that Native American reservations deal with: poverty, crime, alcohol, or addiction. Outside of what the government issues that Palestinians face, what are some of the things that you saw firsthand that they're dealing with on a daily basis?
The lack of the ability to access things like water, food at a reasonable cost, healthy food, fruits and vegetables, basic human needs, I think, are severely diminished over there, as they are on reservations too. Usually, things of healthy nature, items of healthy nature, are more expensive on reservations, or the quality is low. A lot of times reservations are the dumping grounds of larger grocery chains. That's where they send kind of the stuff that's a little bit wilted, and so just access to things that make one healthy. Those basic needs. Communications too was often cut off in Palestine at a spur of a moment, never knowing when cell phone connection would go down. And then also division between families because of the different boundaries of the different areas. Some are more confined than others, but it's proven to just cut off families. You can't go and visit, you know, your relatives anymore, and that's much the same with reservations too. It's difficult to visit family members, so you lose that aspect of strength in family, an extended family.
If I could follow with that, seeing your experience with reservations here in America and your experiences over time with Palestine, do you see any kind of improving or any kind of hope for improvement in the future for both situations?
You know, where I've seen hope is in young people. And yeah, I think that's where I see most hope, is when I get the opportunity to be in schools, to hang out with young people. I see that there's this desire to know the full story, to build awareness, to say, you know, this isn't. Oh, let me share with you something that I know Felipe is familiar with. In a lot of our talks, Felipe and I do trainings for dismantling racism and racism awareness. We use an iceberg model. And so we talk about, most often, all we know about icebergs is that which you can see above the water. 10% of the iceberg you can see above the water. And we don't realize that 90% of the issue is underneath, and it's harder to see. And so if all you know about the issue is that 10%, that all of your activities, all of your resources are going to go to just addressing the symptoms, basically. And I think that's what we've been trying to do for a lot of years, is address these issues by just seeing what we can see above the water. Just what we know, what we learn in mainstream media, the little bits that we learn in high school and grade school and in some cases universities. But if we understand, and this is where I see the hope in young people, is that they're saying we need to put our faces into the water. And we need to understand what's going on underneath and direct our energies at changing that, because that's going to affect even better that which we see above the water. It's going to address the symptoms a lot better if we focus on what's underneath. Now, it's scary to go underneath the water. It's more difficult to go underneath the water. But I see in young people that desire to do so. I was excited to come here and talk with you all because I knew I would also feel that from you folks, this desire to go underneath. Let's understand this story from a better perspective that gives us true solutions and not just deals with the tip of the iceberg. Any other thoughts, questions?
Do you think that politics in the U.S. today encourages peace, or do you think it discourages peace by the way they do it?
You know, that's a good question. In Canada, we have a parliamentary system. The House is divided into two sides. So you have benches on one side, benches on the other side. The width between, in the middle of the room, is the length of two swords. So that back in the day, if they brought their swords in, they couldn't reach each other. And you should see how they interact. They yell, they scream, they whine, they kick, they cut each other down. It's just like, to me, it's inappropriate for grown adults to be behaving that way. And I think that the system of governance that we have, both, I think in Western world, I don't have to just focus on US or Canada. I think it encourages inappropriate behavior. It encourages, thinking really quick solutions that haven't been well thought out, maybe that focus more on the needs of just a few people rather than on the needs of everybody. So I think I don't know what it encourages, but I don't think it encourages true peace. True peace. Yeah, I remain hopeful. I do. I think as more and more of us recognize that we have to make some changes here. Things are not. The environment is suffering. There's a lot of reasons why we need to change. And I think the more that we can encourage critical thinking and analytical thinking in young people, I think as they get older, then they'll have the skills to think beyond the boxes that we've created for ourselves in the Western world. And I want to keep bringing this back too, that it's not just me pointing fingers at the Western world, because I see this happening in our communities too. That we aren't following those ways that we understood that were valuable and good for thousands of years. We're starting to follow, or we are following Western processes that are not being very helpful and actually are hurting a lot of people rather than helping. So I recognize that within my own life and within my own native communities too. Any other thoughts, comments?
I had a second question. I was wondering if you met anyone who had been a personal victim or had family members that were victims of IVF, and psychologically, how did they deal with this?
Yeah, yeah. We met from every part of society in the Middle East. We met people who've been traumatized. It was sometimes you could just see it. It might not even be focusing on a particular occurrence, but you can hear it and feel it in your conversations with them. Now, I've done a lot of looking into trauma. I do a lot of trauma healing. I've worked on my own trauma healing, so I can see the signs of the effects of trauma. So I think I can see it perhaps a little bit easier. But that's a really good question, because if you ever get a chance to look at the work of Dr. Joy DeGruy, she does work around what she calls post-traumatic slave syndrome. And she looks at this whole issue of post-traumatic stress. And she talks about it from an African-American experience, and she says, there was an over 280-year history of legalized slavery in the U.S. And we forget that, and we don't realize that had an effect on American society. It produced traumatic experiences in African-American community. And then she goes on further to talk about how we've taken on, as people who've been oppressed, traditions that are built or influenced by post-traumatic stress, and consider them traditional. And that's who we are, that's our identity. We don't realize that really that what we're doing is perpetuating the cycles of post-traumatic stress in our lives. So I think we have to do some really deep thinking around trauma and its effect on who we are as human beings. That also gives me hope, whoever asked the question. I know people, I look at myself, I look at my friends who've done healing around historical trauma as well as traumas in their lives, and see the difference that they make in their decisions and in their ability to engage in really helpful conversations and functions in society that are making change. So I think it's connected with that trauma thing. We have to look at that issue and figure out how to actually heal ourselves from these historical traumas.
So the families you have met and people you have seen who suffer such trauma, did you ever ask them, like, what are some of the methods they use in overcoming such problems, and what kind of responses do they give?
Oh, excellent question. Yeah. I mean, nowadays I ask that question a lot more. It has a lot to do with brain activity. For those of you who have done study around what happens to a person who's experienced trauma, especially children, and it's gone unresolved, it gets trapped. Trauma gets trapped in your brain as images and feelings. And that's why you get triggered. I don't know if any of you experience being triggered. When something reminds you, and maybe you don't even know this, but something reminds you of a traumatic experience, your heart starts to race, you sweat. Your body is actually reverting back to that time when you experienced that, and it's producing the same experience that you had back then. And so to heal from that, you have to embrace that memory in a safe way that helps to change the neurological patterns of your brain in order to heal from that traumatic experience. So there's many different societies that have ways. We had ways. We had as a Dakota person in our culture, we had a process, a ceremony called Nahik Chopi, and it means calling back the spirit. It acknowledged that when people experience a traumatic activity or something traumatic in their lives, that they had to go through a process that was marked by a ceremony at the end of calling back your spirit. And for me, that's what the brain is damaged, and so that you have to kind of almost trick your brain into healing itself, and so that memory of that trauma isn't trapped in only feelings and images. It goes to the other side of the brain where that provides sequencing and reasoning. So you can still see the same thing that reminds you of that trauma, but your brain will say, oh, but it's okay. I don't have to revert back to the beating heart and all that because I have a reasoning now. That happened a long time ago. I've moved on. I've been able to incorporate into my healing and my way of life, so it's not going to affect me anymore. That's when both sides of your brain are functioning as they should appropriately. So many different societies had different ways of doing things. I've traveled to India, and there's like Buddhist ways, and I would say that every major religion, every religion in this world had a way of thinking about healing. And it was about incorporating both sides of your brain, whether it was through music or art or meditation or using incense or whatever. There's different ways that you can change the neurological patterns that your brain produces when it has unresolved trauma and make them healthy neurological patterns. Acupuncture is another one that is helpful. So there's many different ways, and many different our societies had a different way. Even the act of, like I mentioned, sulha, drinking coffee, sitting in a circle, even going around in a circle in a certain order, one by one, produces. It helps your brain to use both sides as the conversation goes around in a circle. One of the things that I feel, I really think that indigenous cultures from all over the world were very practical. Like, they had thousands of years to develop these understandings, right? These understandings come from mimicking the activity of the world around. And I just think they were brilliant. But yet very logical, very simple ways of dealing with regular, common occurrences in the human experience. Conflict is always going to happen in our lives. It happens in the environment around us, right? There's storms that happen, there's lightning, all of that is a buildup of energy, and then there has to be a release somehow. We go through those occurrences too. Conflict is natural. But I think what we've gotten away from figuring out how to deal with conflict in a way that's helpful, that incorporates our entire being. All right, any more questions?
Were you able to meet with Israeli Arabs as well, and does their amount of optimism vary from the other Palestinians?
Oh, yes, we did meet with Israeli Arabs, and the dynamics that they were living under had all different kinds of, it plays out differently in their lives. Like, there were some that couldn't leave certain parts of Jerusalem, because if they did, they would lose their papers, and then they would be expelled. But I think we visited this one Arab community that had found housing in a mosque that was being built, and this group of people didn't have anywhere to go. If they would have left that part of Jerusalem, they would have lost their papers. So they stopped building the church and the place of worship, and then they converted it into very simple, very basic living quarters. And I remember walking through there with our Palestinian friends and colleagues, and one of them said, "This is the breeding ground of violence, because of the violence that's enacted on them. If there's no hope or resolution or solution in sight, it just continues that cycle of violence." And that was one of my learnings that I had over there that sticks with me. And I see that in, once again, in reservation life. A lot of our young people are going towards gang activity and getting into all kinds of trouble and issues, and reverting to violence as a way of life. And I see that as a result of reservation life here in North America, as well as in urban centers too, where there's high poverty and stuff like that. It's becoming almost a way of life. So, yeah. Any other thoughts? Yes.
As the Palestinians right now are going through a process that indigenous people what kind of lesson or advice can you give for the Palestinians to deal with the conflict, like a single advice for most people?
I think probably one of the most powerful experiences in my life that I would give as advice to Palestinian folks is to not forget the stories, to tell the stories, to not forget. Like every 2 years I participate in a walk from the southwestern corner of Minnesota to the Twin Cities. And it's to reenact a forced march that my people were under, where many of us were killed and we were put into internment camps in the Twin Cities, and then the following year dispersed to reservations in South Dakota, and my people fled to Canada. That's how my ancestors ended up in Canada. So we reenact that walk, and we walk that. It's like 200 miles. And my wife, who is of European descent, she said as we were participating, she said, and it's important for my girls, my daughters, to experience this. She said, we don't do this as white people. We don't remember our history. Like she's one of the few that can look back a few generations and say, these were my relatives here, this is where we came from, this is where we lived. But if you talk to many different white folks from North America, they don't know much of their history. They've forgotten their history, even just a few generations back. So I would say it's important to remember the stories, and also to provide that eagle's eye view of what was going on, of making the connections to the other influences and aspects of the story. So it's not just focused on the traumatic experience, but of a deeper understanding of why this happened and how we can make change. Provide some understanding of how we can move forward. What's the best for us as a people? Yeah. Any other thoughts, questions?
If not, then great. Thank you all for coming tonight. Okay. Well, one of the things that I will say, based on what Harley was talking about, is the importance to making these connections, right? These global connections. Part of what we often misunderstand from the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s was that it was a global movement, right? It drew strength from anti-colonial movements around the world, and this is really sort of that shared story that we have. And part of critical thinking is to be able to make those connections. So I encourage you, as you continue on in your education, to tap into some of the great work that Aggies for Palestine is doing here on campus. Attend some of the events. Engage in those circles of drinking coffee or whatever else you all might want to drink when you're in a circle. So thank you again for coming out tonight.
Aggies for Palestine would like to really thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come and visit with us. And we wanted to give you our shirt, our Aggies for Freedom shirt.
Oh, thank you.
And a couple of free Palestine bracelets.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much.
Have a great night, everybody. Harley will be around here if you have any other questions for him later.
You guys want to join the
And there's still some
on
cookies.
Facebook, Aggies for Palestine on Facebook.